BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. This episode of Black Box Online Radio is brought to you by Rep Sports and Raze Energy. Are you a fan of energy drinks, protein shakes, and health foods? Well, I sure am. I use the stuff almost every single day. They sell Raze Energy products at my local gym, but you can have them shipped to your home. Use the coupon code NED075, that's NED075, for discounts applied at the checkout. The link is in the description box. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the show. This is the first episode in a revival of my series on the Long Island serial killer, one of the more saddening mysteries out there in the true crime world, but I still believe there are some valuable explorations. And not only that, not only talking about exploring human psychology, this is an unsolved case, and we are hoping that one day the authorities will be able to identify the perpetrator, or perpetrators plural, that are behind these sets of murders. The motivation for this series is mostly twofold. The first is that last year on this channel I did several episodes about the Long Island serial killer, and I was going through the case victim by victim, and that was simply not completed. So I think this is a very good opportunity to talk about all the victims and then the possible victims of the Long Island serial killer. And the second motivation was that I was doing a regular series on BBOR about the disappearance of Donna Lass from 1970, which came out every Thursday last year, and that went on for about 3 or 4 months. And then I gave you guys a polling question about which true crime case did you want to hear more about, and people voted for the Long Island serial killer. And I did several episodes in a different way, because what I decided to do for that series was something called the Versus series, where I would talk about two different people in the true crime world, usually serial killers, and do a psychological breakdown, comparing and contrasting, talking about the similarities and differences. And yes, the Long Island serial killer was frequently mentioned in the Versus series because you guys voted for that. But I really felt that the examinations into the Long Island serial killer purely as a standalone series were just unfinished, so I wanted to keep talking about the case, as well as drawing attention to the story victim by victim, because each person has a story to share. And if you would like to follow along with any of these discussions, I would invite you to like and subscribe to the channel so you can tune in every Wednesday for as long as we're going to go with the Long Island serial killer. And I would like to begin with the Long Island serial killer's first confirmed victim, who was the Fire Island Jane Doe. To this day, she has still been unidentified. No one has conclusively found the identity of the Fire Island Jane Doe, and her remains were first discovered in 1996. I would like to go to a website called Unidentified Wiki that says the Fire Island Jane Doe was a victim of the Long Island serial killer. Her legs were discovered in 1996, and her skull was located in 2011. She is the earliest recorded victim of the killer, and it really is difficult to find the first true victim of the Long Island serial killer, because unlike somebody such as the Zodiac Killer, for example, who's writing in these letters taking credit for crimes, and many people have done that. The Son of Sam also did that as well, or even the serial killer, Maury Travis, tried to contact the police. This is not something that is regularly, I repeat, regularly done by the Long Island serial killer, these types of taunts. So mostly it appears that this is a serial killer who started out by dismembering the bodies of the victims and then stopped later on. But when? When was the first victim? When was the last victim? Very difficult to know. And not only that, not even all the remains of the victims have been found. As you heard very clearly from this introduction, the legs of the Fire Island Jane Doe were first found in '96, and it wasn't until 2011 that they found her skull. When I was reading on a different site, the story that I encountered was that a man and a woman were out walking, and they saw two objects that they didn't recognize, and upon further inspection, they found out that they were actually the legs of a woman. And there was an excellent page that had been created on the Doe Network's case file, and that has been shared here one more time. You can get this at doenetwork.org, and it says that she was discovered on April 20th of 1996 near Blue Point Beach, Suffolk County, New York. It is also estimated that she was murdered in 1996, and they found partial remains with soft tissue, and certainly she was murdered. I mean, this cause of death is homicide. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Now, the age of the Fire Island Jane Doe was very difficult for them to determine. They estimate somewhere between 18 and 50 years old, and I can comprehend how difficult that would be without a full set of skeletal remains, even though I'm not a forensic scientist myself. She was a Caucasian female. Her height was unknown, weight was unknown, hair and eye color were also unknown, but these are the real clues that they have to her identity. On her right lower leg, she has a 3.5-inch scar, and the lateral mid leg had a 1-inch linear scar on the lateral mid to lower leg, and she had a 1/2-inch scar on the median part of her ankle, and the left leg had a 2-inch surgical scar with adjacent sutures on the ankle. The victim may have had surgery on her left ankle, and red nail polish were found on all of her toes. And this page also states that she did not have any clothing or any jewelry or any personal items at all near where the body was found or on her body. So that's all they have to go on. I really think that the clue for this would simply be that there are surgical scars, and somebody must have known who she was in 1996. And I mean, people go missing for decades and people are actively looking for them, but that seems to be one of the ways that could have clued people in. They continue by saying she is known as Fire Island Jane Doe. She is one of the 11 victims found along the remote Long Island Highway. 10 of the victims are believed to have been that of a serial killer, and perhaps the one that is not might be that might be referring to the death of Shannon Gilbert, who was very influential in starting the investigation, and that has been dramatized in the book and film Lost Girls. But if you're listening to this episode, I'm sure you have some familiarity with the death of Shannon Gilbert. She is the woman who was driven out to Long Island to meet a man named Joe Brewer. She was driven by Michael Pack, who was the driver for, well, let's just say that he was driving an escort to meet Joe Brewer. The escort was Shannon Gilbert, and something happened. To this day, we simply do not know what had happened. Shannon Gilbert had bipolar disorder, and in Michael Pack's deposition, again, the driver, he said that she was not medicating normally, and sometimes she would even turn to drugs to deal with the effects of her bipolar disorder. Was it a drug reaction? Was it a simple manic episode, or did something more heinous happen? Did somebody actually try to cause physical harm to Shannon Gilbert, and did she just retaliate and respond and run away, and she's running up and down, going to the houses, banging on the doors? She gets on the phone with 911 and making a whole bunch of noise, trying to say that some people are after her, and that is a big thing that they point out, that she said they are after me. So it really is quite confusing about how many people could be involved. And in the movie Lost Girls, I mean, like, this is just something that's analytical. They even point out that she's running away from her own driver, or she doesn't want to go to her driver, Michael Pack, as a person of security. So they were insinuating that that shows some type of lack of awareness, lack of mental awareness, meaning that something may have happened to Shannon. But then while people were looking for Shannon, they discovered numerous bodies of the victims that they believe are connected to a single serial killer. And it's just gruesome that, these types of crimes occur. And even someone like me who talks about true crime regularly on BBOR still has a tough time dealing with this case because not only are the women murdered, but they are also mutilated. I mean, many of them are. The Gilgo Four, who would happen later on, were not mutilated. But that just begs the question about what on earth is this person doing? The victims that were murdered in the late 90s, early 2000s were mutilated, their bodies were torn apart. The Fire Island Jane Doe didn't even have her full set of remains put back together, only finding her legs and then later her skull. And I don't mean to get ahead of myself, but because I did several episodes last year, so many of you guys in the comments section were sharing your theories about the Long Island serial killer, and some people simply say, this was a group. This is a group of people, and it's not even a serial killer group. The people who are doing the mutilating and the discarding of the bodies, they are the henchmen. The henchmen for the rich people who live on Long Island, the elite circles who live on Long Island, and they are involved in some type of snuff ring. I mean, I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest snuff films, like where people are murdered in pornographic videos, but I don't know how anyone would have any evidence that these people are being killed on film, but that they're being murdered as part of a thrill kill club, and they're having their henchmen mutilate the bodies and discard the remains in various places. And a reason why people think there are multiple perpetrators in this case is because it appears that sometimes someone has driven a very long distance to discard one person's remains, and then at another time they drive a very long distance to discard someone else's remains, and then sometimes the remains are close together, and it just seems to be so confusing. And then other people think that this is not a group of henchmen, this is not a snuff ring, this isn't some type of multiple killers theory. They're like, oh no, this is a single killer. It's just at first he started out mutilating the victims because he was trying to hide their identities. Then he realized that that was not going to be practical. For example, Jessica Taylor, one of the victims of the Long Island serial killer, who was murdered in 2003, was mutilated and dismembered, but she was still identified. And then someone thought, okay, not only is that possible, I need to be clear, Jessica Taylor was partially identified because of a tattoo that was on her body that had been mutilated but still easily recognizable. But someone just wrote in the comments section saying their theory was that this person just realized that forensic science had gotten to the point where people can be identified even if they are dismembered, and it's not going to be worth the effort. So the person switched to simply discarding the bodies without mutilating them. And terrible, terrible stuff, but I just wanted to throw those points in there. Now, last year I did read a website rather frequently called gilgocase.com, and they have their little section in the timeline about the death of the Fire Island Jane Doe, and there's another reason why I'm sharing this with you here. On April 20th, 1996, two female legs wrapped in a plastic bag were discovered on the Bayside shore of Fire Island, 1 mile west of Davis Park Beach. The victim is referred to as the Fire Island Jane Doe. The victim's skull would later be found on April 11th, 2011, west of Tobay Beach in Nassau County. Here, she was named Jane Doe Number 7. The two sets of remains were later linked by DNA. Okay, and that is very important because this has also happened multiple times in the Long Island serial killer mystery, when they have a Jane Doe, whether it's Jane Doe number 3 or number 6, and then later on, not only do they get an identity, but they also find out that someone else may have also had their remains scattered in different places. But with Jane Doe number 6, that's a bit of a different story because she was simply identified as Valerie Mack. I was more thinking of Jane Doe number 3. So, to get back to this point here, there's a reason why I wanted to read this entry from GilgoCase.com. It's also because prior to 1996, the first possible crime that GilgoCase.com lists as a suspected Long Island serial killer event is in 1982. It says February 1st, 1982, Tina Folia was last seen on February 1st of 1982 at Hammerhead's music venue in West Islip, New York. Her dismembered body was discovered on February 3rd next to the Southern State Parkway. Her remains were placed in 3 garbage bags. The DNA of an unknown male was found on the bags. That was in 1982. Now, if there is the same serial killer who has been operating up until 2011, this would be horribly abnormal behavior for someone to commit a crime in 1982 and then wait 14 years before they committed their next crime. Nothing's impossible, and it's always important to remember that these things aren't impossible because serial killers do not follow the rules. They break the law. They are criminals. There's no rule book on how to be a serial killer. But in terms of any type of psychopathology, that is almost out of the question that somebody would go 14 years without committing any other crimes. Now, if we actually do look at the timeline, I would highly suspect that either Tina Folia was not actually murdered by the Long Island serial killer, and that was a different perpetrator. Rest in peace to her all the same. Absolutely shocking and horrific what happened to her. But to look at the time frame from 1996 to 2011, that is a 15-year span. That is something that is much more normal and typical of a serial killer. Serial killers tend to operate for a period of maybe 15 years. Sometimes there is a low point where they kind of cool off for a while, and then their destructive tendencies can resurface later on. And also, serial killers are known to murder people if they're trying to cover up actions, like maybe if someone is onto them, someone has almost figured out their identity, or somebody stumbles upon a dark secret that they have concealed. Well, then they want to respond and retaliate, and they prevent that person from revealing the dark secret. And at that point, murder isn't even the primary motive. It's silencing someone who has information. And I also wanted to read an article from LongIsland.com, yes, just that, LongIsland.com, that says a deeper look into the Gilgo Beach murders. And to be very clear, the Gilgo 4 were murders that were discovered much later than the Fire Island Jane Doe, but I do think that some of this material is relevant. Amongst the beautiful beach dunes and picturesque homes lining Long Island's south shore lay a dark secret buried in the underbelly. With this suburban utopia, a most awful secret was hidden, and it may have finally been laid bare for all the world to see. Save the identity of the culprit who committed these crimes. We speak of none other than the infamous Long Island serial killer, also known as the Gilgo Beach Killer and the Craigslist Ripper. Now that's another commonality that they've identified with some of the victims who came later, that they were using the internet, particularly Craigslist, which, as I understand now, Craigslist took down their personal section and they don't have anything about looking for escorts on Craigslist. But the Long Island serial killer was not only mainly targeting escorts, but ones that were advertising on Craigslist. Although with the Fire Island Jane Doe, I think that would be almost out of the question. Yes, of course, Craigslist wasn't around then, but the internet was in its infancy at the time. And to that one person who said that DNA had advanced to a point by 2003 when someone decided that it was no longer practical to dismember the bodies to try and confuse the authorities. Well, DNA was not a big thing back in 1996, and we almost know this for a fact because of the O.J. Simpson trial, about how they tried to talk about the unreliability of DNA. You can remember the exchanges between Barry Scheck and Dennis Fung, and by 2003, though, absolutely DNA was well understood, and people knew that DNA was some type of forensic material that could be analyzed and people could be convicted of it. We had lots of conversations about this back in 2002 and 2003. This show, CSI, was very popular at the time, so I find it hard to believe that someone just simply gave up dismembering the bodies of the victims because of the advances in DNA. And also, Jessica Taylor was murdered in 2003, so I don't know, there may have been a different reason. Some people think, though, that why the Long Island serial killer chose to stop dismembering the bodies was because he was getting older. They think that this is not a group of people, this is not a snuff ring, this is just one person who started dismembering the bodies, and he was getting older, less energy, and he resorted to simply discarding them without any type of mutilation. And that would also go to show you that this isn't some type of Jack the Ripper story where the mutilations are the primary target. And yes, I do believe that about Jack the Ripper. This is someone who has murder as the primary target and still, to this day, did not get captured. Back to the article. An unidentified individual allegedly responsible for the murder of between 10 and 17 women and one man, and the subsequent dumping of their bodies on the Ocean Parkway has been going on for nearly 20 years. In December of 2010, County Police Department officer John Malia and his dog, a German Shepherd named Blue, were out conducting a search for Shannon Gilbert, age 24, from Jersey City, who had been missing since May 1st of that year. After visiting a client in Oak Beach she had met through Craigslist, the client was named Joe Brewer. While conducting that search in the dunes in the Ocean Parkway on the south shore of Long Island on their own time, Malia and Blue came across something that sparked horror and outrage nationwide: the skeletal remains of women who were stuffed into worn burlap sacks. But I believe that the burlap was heavily degraded at the time, and when you read about the Long Island serial killer, it often states that at least 2 of them were in the burlap. That's the way that it's often phrased, meaning not all of the women were concealed that way, and also the, as you heard, the unidentified Asian male. But I digress from that. The remains of Shannon Gilbert were not present. However, the horrifying discovery led to a police search of the Ocean Parkway between the towns of Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach in Suffolk County, and the area of Jones Beach State Park in Nassau County. 2 days later, the search uncovered 3 more bodies, all female, that had been unceremoniously dumped amongst the dunes and thick vegetation lining the roadway. It was at this time that the Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer was quoted by the news media saying the unfathomable: 4 bodies found in the same location pretty much speaks for itself. It's more than a coincidence. We could have a serial killer. But it's important to remember that the Long Island serial killer was not only operating as early as 1996. The authorities absolutely knew that there was a serial killer in the area. And when you read some of the earlier articles talking about the murder of Jessica Taylor, as well as Jane Doe number 6, who has since been identified as Valerie Mack, they talked about how there was a serial killer who was operating, whom they gave the name the Manorville Butcher. They were aware of the previous crimes prior to the Gilgo 4. And I'll jump ahead to the part about the Fire Island Jane Doe. On April 22nd, police found 2 human teeth while hacking through thick brush alongside Ocean Parkway with machetes and chainsaws. Officials had reported previously that the dense vegetation in the area was making their search difficult. These partial remains have never been identified except as Jane Doe number 3 and Jane Doe number 7. The remains of Jane Doe number 3 were discovered in a plastic bag near Jones Beach State Park. DNA analysis indicated her to be the mother of Baby Doe, and we'll have to talk about that in a future episode because that's a very big story. DNA also linked Jane Doe number 7, whose skull and several teeth were recovered at Tobay Beach, to a set of severed legs found in a garbage bag on Fire Island in 1996. On September 20th of 2011, police released the composite sketch of Jane Doe number 6, in addition to the photographs of jewelry that was worn by the John Doe, that's the unidentified Asian male, and also the items of baby doe in hopes of identifying all the victims. And throughout this series, I would like to read some of your comments that you have left on previous episodes. I mean, you plural, you guys in the audience, that you've left on some of the other Long Island serial killer episodes here on this channel. And this one was from the Long Island Serial Killer Suspect List episode and was written by Sirius B. I think that this was two serial killers and their dumping grounds. The burlap sack ones were one killer, then the others were either one or even two more killers. I'm sure the killers/killers plural have a new dumping ground. The list case is still active, so who knows? Absolutely, and that's just what it comes down to. We do not have any certainty about how many people were involved with this. Could there have been accomplices? Could there have been somebody covering up? Could one person be committing the crimes and someone simply has a lookout? And you can even find that when you have sometimes a husband and wife team or a boyfriend and girlfriend team. Like, for example, Stephen Marshall, the Jigsaw killer from the United Kingdom, would have his girlfriend act as an accomplice of sorts, even though he's doing the dismembering of the bodies. Things like that do happen, and it's all just guesswork at this point. And we have a comment on the episode, The Long Island Serial Killer Introduction, from William Bloodworth, who also says, I believe it's likely that these murders are part of an underground snuff film ring. I mean, you have multiple people who have been murdered over a span of 15 years. The motive does not seem to be 100% clear. Okay, you could say this is just a single man who has animosity toward women, terrible childhood, that typical single serial killer angle. But why all the differences? We simply don't have an explanation. And I'm not an expert on the serial killer Joel Rifkin. I've heard a couple podcasts about him, but I've never done an episode on him myself. I mentioned him briefly in one on this channel called The Brain of a Serial Killer, an old black box recording. But someone wrote in on one of the Long Island serial killer episodes saying that he started out by dismembering the bodies of the victims and then stopped at a certain point. I mean, and even if there's some gray area on the details, or I'm not an expert on him, it's definitely possible for a human being to do that, to have a reason why they're changing their MOs. And one point, though, that I was perhaps not exactly aware of when I first started making episodes on BBOR, that this whole thing about a serial killer having a pattern, it's almost media distortion. So many serial killers deviate from their patterns. And you will see this time and time again. If you're reading about a serial killer who's a strangler, who kills through blunt force trauma, usually they have at least one victim that was not killed in that particular way. I mean, even the Zodiac killer murdered a woman by knife when the other victims were killed by guns, and you encounter that all the time. But we have a comment from Mystery Junkie who says, most they have to go on is that the killer is a resident of Long Island and has access to burlap sacks, which means anyone. Well, as far as the killer being a resident of Long Island, one theory is that he isn't a full-time resident, if there is a killer or group of killers, that we're not dealing with full-time residents, seasonal work, or as I said, if this is a group, then people are coming in and out. Some people who work with something maritime related, something fishing boat related, something that deals with seafaring, and that is just why they are not there all the time, or it would explain infrequency in activities. And as far as the seaside nature of Long Island goes, I don't have this article in front of me, but it wasn't on my YouTube channel. But in the comments section on that article, somebody asked the question about why didn't someone find the serial killer graveyard earlier? How could people not notice the stench of rotting bodies in the air if they were walking on the beach or living in the community nearby? And somebody responded by saying that she was a native of Long Island and said it was close to the ocean. I mean, it is seaside. You're only going to smell the ocean air at that point, and I completely agree with that person. And finally, I would like to leave you with something a little bit more optimistic. As I was reading about the Fire Island Jane Doe, I found that numerous articles came up about Fire Island John Doe, who was an unidentified person from Alaska, where his remains were found in Alaska. At first, I thought that the Fire Island Jane Doe and the Long Island serial killer mystery had been identified, but no, this is somebody else. This is a Fire Island John Doe, and he is all over the internet. I had not heard of this case until recently, but the reason why I want to read this off is because it shows us that sometimes, even after decades, a true crime case can be solved. And it seems hopeless, it seems impossible, but sometimes these things can happen even when we're not expecting it. By we, I mean us and the general public. I mean, for example, the Golden State Killer mystery was solved. They identified him, Joseph D'Angelo. And even in this year now, we have seen several true crime discoveries. The remains of Brandon Lawson were found in Texas. The story of Sherry Papini was determined to have been a hoax. The perpetrator was arrested in the Elijah Wood racetrack murder, and one that I talked about on Black Box Online Radio that isn't super popular. The man who murdered Dwayne Simmons, Frankie Mendez, was convicted. All kinds of breakthroughs in the true crime world, and maybe one day there will be answers in the Long Island serial killer mystery. But I want to be very clear one more time. This is the story of the Fire Island John Doe, an unrelated case from Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska State Police officials have announced for the second time in 6 weeks that DNA and genetic genealogy have helped identify a murder victim whose name has been long unknown. Troopers said Wednesday that a man slain in 1989 on Fire Island, west of Anchorage, Alaska, has been identified as Michael Beavers, a missing man last seen alive in November of 1979. Beavers, age 40, was reported missing by his wife in January of 1980 after he failed to come back from a business trip. Beavers' identification comes on the heels of the identification in October of Robin Pelkey, age 19, who vanished in the early 1980s while living in Alaska. And they actually have a note here about DNA. It says, Alaskan authorities in 2021 announced that they had identified Robin Pelkey left as one of the victims of the notorious serial killer Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Hansen was a serial killer called the Butcher Baker. I have 3 episodes about him on this channel, and I'm very glad to hear that, because when I did my episodes, there were still unidentified victims here, and I'm very glad to know that there are some breakthroughs in that case as well. And Robert Hansen led the authorities in 1984 to Pelkey's remains, but did not know her name. Pelkey, who was 19 when she died, was unknown for 37 years, so she was given the nickname Horseshoe Harriet because she was found near Horseshoe Lake in Anchorage. The Fire Island John Doe, though, Michael Beavers, was a heavy equipment operator, and he owned an excavation business in Chugiak, a rural community about 20 miles outside of downtown Anchorage, and according to the troopers and authorities, he told his wife that he left home. His wife told them that he left home in 1979 for a 2,300-mile drive to Seattle, where he was planning to meet a business associate, but Michael Beavers never arrived in Seattle, and it was simply a mystery about what happened to him. He was declared dead in 1992. Meanwhile, human remains have been found on July 4th of 1989 on the northwest side of Fire Island, a tiny island just off the coast of Anchorage. At the time, the authorities determined that the remains belonged to a white male somewhere between 35 and 50 years old. And it's amazing they had this DNA breakthrough. Genetic genealogy is going to be very valuable. But did you hear that, though? A male between the ages of 35 and 50 years old. That's somewhat of a reasonable demographic to investigate. With the Fire Island Jane Doe, age 18 to 50, I mean, that's a much larger age range. I mean, that's practically double, more than double. I mean, that's like, let's see, is that 32 years? And versus a 15-year age range. But on a concluding note, I mean, firstly, rest in peace to Michael Beavers, as well as to Robin Pelkey, the victim of the Butcher Baker serial killer. But I personally believe that the Fire Island Jane Doe would have been much closer to age 18 rather than age 50, although anything is possible. And I think that the authorities must be leaning in a particular way, even though they haven't announced that exactly. So we're just going to have to hope that some type of breakthrough will happen. But I hope that those last two stories there of Robin Pelkey and the Fire Island John Doe, who has since been identified as Michael Beavers, will show us that it's possible that we can get answers. And when I was reading about Robin Pelkey in 2019, I had no idea who she was, the unidentified victim of the serial killer Robert Christian Hansen, and I was thinking that people will probably never figure it out. They will never figure out who this person was because there are some cases that do not get solved in a human lifetime. But it goes to show you that forensic sciences are advancing all the time, and maybe we'll get answers about who was the Fire Island Jane Doe in the next couple years, and maybe the Long Island serial killer and the truth behind that mystery will come to light. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And I will see you over on Instagram, BlackBoxNid88 for the bonus podcast. Until next time.